just going to give it right over to Graham.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you to also the other Carrie for having me. This is great. I'm also a mentor in residence at Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures and work with the I-Corps program as well as a mentor. So it's great to be able to connect with you with this program as well. I'll go ahead and share my screen and just get started here. All right. So a little bit more about me. I am the executive director of the Mid-Atlantic Gigabit Innovation Collaboratory, which is a 501c3 dedicated to economic development, workforce development out here in Central Maryland. That's our banner right there. I'm a lead organizer of 1 Million Cups, which is a program of the Kauffman Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the country set up to support entrepreneurship. And we have the only 1 Million Cups program in all of Maryland out here as well. It's a virtual meeting right now, so it meets weekly, and we have different, startup entrepreneurs at different stages of the life cycle who come out and virtually and present their ideas. As I mentioned before, I'm a mentor in residence at Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, a founding partner of a relatively new PPE startup called Shield Pals, and founding CEO of probably my first big startup, which is called Sick Weather. It's still going strong. I am an alumnus of Techstars, 500 Startups, the Sprint Accelerator, and Plug and Play Tech Center. These are all other types of accelerator programs like the one that you're engaged in with FastForward. I'm a patented inventor, and I'm a father of 5, which is actually really the most challenging part of all of those credentials. So we're talking about minimum viable products, or MVPs. And if you've never heard that term before, it's okay. It's sort of one of these terms that you get exposed to as a startup entrepreneur. When you start talking to investors, you start talking with potential partners. And Carrie, I see that there are other people waiting to be admitted, just so you know. I see that alert too. So I won't. Do you need to be co-host in order to let them in, or should I let them in?
I got him.
Okay, all right. So what is a minimum viable product? Well, some people kind of associate this with a prototype, and I think that that's incorrect. The key word being viable means viable in the marketplace. And what it really is the result of the design thinking process. If you're not familiar with that term, I'll dig into that in a little bit. It's something that is accessible and available, so your target customer can actually get to it and try it out. And likewise, it's usable. It's not too buggy. They can actually get through the whole experience as you intend them to. And then also, sort of most importantly, it's measurable, so you can track the success of it in terms of its efficacy, and it's marketable. It's something that you can actually take to market, whether or not it totally embarrasses you. And that brings me to my first sort of big quote by Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, is that if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, then you've launched too late. And that is something that a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, live by, or should live by, because oftentimes I've seen entrepreneurs that they try to dial in everything to be perfect and perfect and perfect. And what they find is that some other competitor got way out ahead of them. And so they weren't first to market, and they lost that opportunity. It also speaks to the fact that, this isn't, again, MVP, it's not a prototype like you would share internally. It is something that goes out into the world, and that you can be embarrassed by, and that's okay. So I mentioned the design thinking process, and if that's another new term for you, again, it's okay. These are all sort of, this is the jargon of the entrepreneur, and you'll get used to it. And actually, design thinking isn't just used in entrepreneurship and startups. It's used, by large corporations as well when they want to develop something new and take something new to market. And it's broken down to 3 essential phases. The understanding phase, where you empathize with the problem or the customer, and you kind of try to understand, like, what is the problem? What's that problem statement you're trying to solve? Second phase is you explore. You actually ideate and you prototype. Again, this is the difference between an MVP and a prototype. This is part of the design thinking process, is the prototype itself. So you explore ideas, you explore possible solutions as prototypes. And then you materialize by testing and implementing. And at any point, if you see in this graph, the arrows kind of bounce back. At any point, you could have a sort of, you could realize you need to go back a step and start over, and that's okay. That's all part of the process. And then you may even get all the way to implementation and realize this wasn't the right solution. And you go all the way back to the understanding phase of it to try to re-understand the problem at hand. So that's the design thinking process. So when I say the MVP is the result of this process, this is what I'm referring to. So in that graph, we show arrows going back, right? So what causes that? What causes you to have, get all the way through that cycle, implement it, and then realize it's not the right solution, or it's not exactly the right solution? Well, I've broken that down into 3 different post-MVP shifts. You have a demand shift that is sort of inbound. So you've got customers telling you that they want something different. You have the discovery shift, which is outbound. You went out and you surveyed people and you gathered intel. And so then you realize, oh, well, what I did isn't exactly right. So then you shift accordingly. Or, a third sort of less, it's not as obvious necessarily, but it's an internal analysis of the data. You're measuring your own, key performance indicators. And I'll talk more about KPIs as well today. So, and in each one of these, there's sort of a risk that you have the risk of making the wrong decision in terms of that fork in the road to either keep moving forward with that MVP or go back and completely redo it. And so with the demand shift, the risk is that you could be considered distracted. And this happens to entrepreneurs all the time when the customers sort of help them evolve the idea. And you might hear let's say you have an investor and they're on your board and you're explaining, oh, we're going to go in this direction now because the customers are saying this. You could be accused of getting distracted or being too opportunistic if it's kind of too far afield from the original problem that you're trying to solve. So you have to make sure that you're not sort of going in that direction. So when you get that kind of inbound feedback, you have to sort of weigh it against, is this actually the same problem or not? The discovery shift, the risk here is that if you go out and you survey too much and you have sort of this design by committee approach to it, you might have unknown demand. You might be drawing out problems that don't exist sometimes. So there's that risk of actually, is that really the demand and is it really scalable? And so you have to then, kind of internalize that yourself as well and figure out if that's the right way to go. And then you have the data shift. So the data shift risk, of course, is like pixel pushing, as I call it. And in the design world, pixel pushing refers to when you're working with a client on, let's say, a design of an ad campaign, and they say, "Oh, I want that image of that person moved a little bit to the right. No, I want back to the left or whatever." So, and you could end up with not having enough context either for evaluating that change. So those are just the risks that are associated with each opportunity of how you might then adjust. So, some of these things aren't always going to be obvious right away. You have to kind of make sure you contextualize everything. So here are some examples from my own experience. So 8 years ago, or 9 years ago now, I started a company, co-founded a company called Sick Weather. And Sick Weather was the result of me as a parent just wanting to know what illnesses were going around. It's very apropos to what's happening today with the pandemic. But at the time, there was no contact tracing. There was no way to understand in real time which illnesses were trending in your area. So I came up with this idea to search social media to do sentiment analysis on tweets and Facebook posts that were public to help understand what symptoms are actually trending across the US right now or across the world. And we ended up doing this in different languages too. It had a worldwide map of real-time sort of trends in the sentiment analysis of symptoms. It started off as a consumer app, and it was actually relatively successful as a startup company in terms of it got lots of great earned media attention. We were on BBC, we were on the Today Show, but we're having a hard time actually getting revenue because we had this sort of, we had to get enough critical mass for an audience as a consumer app to get to the point where that audience was worth money to advertisers. And that was just really hard to do. And it's always hard to do. If your revenue model is strictly advertising, that's one of the hardest revenue models to actually accomplish and to grow to a meaningful size. So instead, we started getting inbound inquiries from ad agencies mostly, who represented pharmaceutical companies, who said, do you have a way of creating like an API that we could use to trigger advertising, on other platforms, not within Sick Weather, but other platforms? So that led to us developing not only an API, but then a forecasting tool, because then the real problem at hand was, well, we also don't know how to plan necessarily. Like, is this going to be a severe flu season or not? So that led to us developing the methodology and machine learning techniques to actually take the data that we were collecting in real time and then predict and project out up to 15 weeks in advance actually what the trends were going to do based on historical analysis as well. So that was a demand sheet. That was customers telling us, hey, this is all well and good, but what we really need is this, right? And then you shift to that. The second example is a company called Shield Pals that I started relatively recently, where I joined as a partner. And it was a result of COVID. So some friends of mine had a manufacturing business, actually manufacturing events and exhibits for trade shows. And they're relatively successful at it. They had clients like Google and Facebook and the White House and other big agencies. And when COVID hit, they had to shut everything down, furlough all their staff. So then they found out that they could retool their manufacturing capabilities to produce gowns and produce face shields and some other products, personal protective equipment products in response to the pandemic. This actually allowed them to bring everyone back to work. And so but that's not the pivot. That's a pivot for them in terms of staying in business, but that's not what the MVP pivot was. The MVP pivot, and this was after they established a whole new brand called Shield Pals, and after I got involved and started helping them with figuring out like what's the next move, is that we surveyed some of the people that were buying the equipment. It was mostly nurses and doctors in pediatric healthcare or pediatric dentistry. And we started asking them about like, well, what if we, besides PPE, what if we also had some sort of consumable media publishing type content that you would license from Shield Pals that falls into the same theme with all the different, because we had these characters. That was the unique thing about Shield Pals. It is the unique thing is that they're like characters. Like it makes you look like you have an Instagram filter over your face. And it was meant to kind of help relieve anxiety in pediatric healthcare so that the kids could actually connect with something, an avatar of a fox or a queen or a dog or whatever, in lieu of being able to see the healthcare worker's actual face behind the mask and everything. So we assumed that this was actually going to lead into like a publishing play. But what we found out after talking to people was that that there was this opportunity to actually create an AR experience where, in addition to these materials, we could design a product that would allow them to do like appointment reminders and in-lobby experiences that revolved around these characters that we had created. And that the easiest way to do that would be through a software application that would let the healthcare worker record a message to their patient, say, hey, Peter, you're coming in for tooth cleaning today, or getting your blood drawn today. We're so excited to see you. This is what you can expect. When you come in, make sure you wait over here, like that kind of stuff, like acting almost like a concierge to the whole experience. And so we have since now developed this AR concierge app that is now what is driving the conversations with investors and private equity firms in terms of what the value is that we're bringing to the table there in terms of relieving anxiety. So those are just two examples from my own experience. I'm happy to answer any more questions about that kind of stuff as we go through. And I'll pause in a few slides so you guys can ask some questions. So the other thing you need to know about taking your MVP to market is that customers don't always have all the answers. And through the I-Core program at Hopkins, and I'm sure you guys are taught to go out there and interview customers and to get that feedback. But they might not know what they want, and that's common. And this is and if they did, maybe they would build it themselves, right? That's possible. If you're addressing a sophisticated enough industry that they really knew what the problem was, they might go off and solve it themselves. There's a great story about the founders of PayPal who, when asked, why were they able to get so much market share early on, when companies like Visa and MasterCard and American Express could have easily have done what they had done. And it was because their answer was that they were busy minding their own business. They were busy doing their business model. They didn't really have any entrepreneurship at those companies to build it themselves. So that's the other reason why that might not happen in every case. So just because you have an idea that may seem obvious, it doesn't necessarily mean that the industry is going to solve that problem on their own. So that objection of if they did, they would build it themselves is, that's less common. But then also you still have to put the solution in context of your own expertise and capabilities. So yes, they might not know what they want. Customers don't have all the answers, but and even if they did, you would still have to figure out the right way to execute it based on what of your industry, how it would be solved in the context of your experience. And that's what I think Steve Jobs meant when he said this. So he said, I think Henry Ford once said, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. People don't know what they want until you show it to them, which is taken out of you hear that a lot. That part is taken out of this context. That's why I never rely on market research. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. So I think what Steve Jobs is really referring to in this quote is he's not saying that people are idiots and they don't know what they want. He's the only one that can tell them. He's saying that they don't know how to articulate exactly what they want because they're not necessarily in the same industry. So people that want a faster solution, per the Henry Ford quote, they might just think it does mean a faster horse, whereas Henry Ford knew, well, actually, no, it's a combustible engine and it's an assembly line, it's a car, it's this automobile. Likewise, Steve Jobs knew that in the context of his expertise in technology, that there was a better solution to, the computer, the phone, whatever else. Okay, so here's where I'd like to, sort of pause first. Kind of open it up to discussion a little bit. Have any of you experienced any shifts since launch? Have you launched an MVP yet? Have you had that experience? And if so, what has that been like for you so far? Have you experienced any shifts? If not, if so, what kind? If not, why? And I don't know, however you want to open it up. If anyone wants to raise a hand or just unmute. And it's okay if you don't have any questions at this point or have no examples of this, that's fine. I can also check the chat. But anyway, all right, I'm going to assume that there's nobody yet in this group that has that MVP experience, and that's okay. So I'm going to move on here. So let's talk about Kate.
I could
yeah, go ahead.
Add some input if that's okay.
Yes, please do.
Hi, so I'm Sindhu. We worked with FastForward U's accelerator last year, and I'm here on behalf of First Fridays group. So basically, last year we were working on a app design in which we would train DJs in how to learn the basics of DJing and then have them perform at events. But kind of based on what you said, we experienced a demand shift in which we kind of realized from our internal DJs that it wasn't really about the training, it was more about finding opportunities to perform. And so what we kind of shifted to now is creating a solution that will connect local venues to vetted high quality DJs. And so that's the current solution we're working on.
That's a perfect example. Yeah, no, that's great. That's exactly what that shift would represent. Yep. And how's that going so far?
It's going really well, actually. We've hired one like front side or front end developer, and now we're searching for a back end developer. So it's been pretty exciting so far.
And have you received any feedback from customers?
We haven't really launched an app yet for this
Gotcha.
idea, but I think we're getting there pretty quickly.
Excellent. Anybody else want to add to that or share? All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here. Okay, so I mentioned KPIs, another acronym that you'll hear bandied about in the startup universe, or in business too. I mean, and that stands for key performance indicators. So what are key performance indicators? Well, they can be audience metrics. If you are, mostly driven, if your product if the success is measured by eyeballs, audience metrics would be your KPI. Sales metrics, of course, is always a great, revenue itself is a great KPI and probably the one that your investors will be paying the most attention to. And also there's some other examples of exhaust data, like the data that's a consequence of your product that can be measured as well, or outcomes metrics. In healthcare could be the health outcomes of the customers that are using the product. Is it adding value to them? So some tools you can at least reference or think about that you want to leverage as you take a MVP to market, depending on what type of product it is. If you're monitoring revenue and sales as your KPI, then you want to probably have a CRM that you're tracking those sales in, like a Salesforce CRM or Pipedrive. Zoho CRM is another new one. I think that's relatively free or it's low cost. Then you've got web and mobile analytics. So if your audience KPIs are your main, if audience is your main KPI, then you want to make sure you're integrating into an analytics platform like a Flurry or Google or Mixpanel. And then there are great ways to visualize these KPIs so that your whole team can kind of gather around them. And I personally have used Gecko Board. I thought that was a really elegant solution for kind of combining and creating your own dashboard of KPIs that your whole team can access. I've also heard about Clipfolio, Grow, Google Data Studio, and I'm sure there's plenty of others out there. And most of these will have some sort of credits programs with startups. So like, Salesforce has like a startup program, for example. So if some of these more premium products are too expensive, usually you can request some sort of startup credit and there'll be some sort of avenue to get access to those credits. All right, so the other interesting outcome of these sort of shifts in your MVP that we've discussed now would be how it's changed your perception of the marketplace. So another possibility is that after you've launched your MVP and after you've realized that you need to go back to the drawing board, it may actually change what your marketplace is. Are you creating a new marketplace might be the result of something like that. And how did you calculate your total addressable market, for example? These are all aspects of the impact that testing and launching your MVP can have. So if you're not familiar with this type of graph here, this is what a lot of investors will expect to see when you're pitching, in terms of understanding your marketplace, and be prepared for your MVP to redefine what your marketplace is. All right, so here's a great quote from Neil Patel. Let's be clear, you never actually sell anything to a business. You sell to people who work inside of a business. And so now we're going to kind of transition to talking about going to market and selling your MVP. Because again, the MVP, the V is for viable. It means that you're actually able to take it to market. So in the enterprise world, you want to ask these questions. How who are, in terms of who are the customers, what do they want you to do? Do they want you to help them increase their revenue? Do they want what are their pain points? Is it decrease costs, get them new customers, keep up with or get past competitors? How important is it? Is it a problem or a need? The decisions, how are the decisions made? Who is the person in pain? Who's the right decision maker that you're going to talk to? Who is the influencer? Who is the person that's referring the business? Who is the saboteur? You'll hear about that in the I-Corps program as well. We'll talk about this. Who is the economic buyer? And then these are various steps to, addressing, how well manifested is the problem. Do they have a problem? Are they aware of having the problem? Have they been actively looking for a solution? Have they assembled a solution out of parts already? These are all steps in how people are going to try to overcome those problems until you come along. And knowing what stage they are at is going to help you understand if maybe you're too early yet or not. Certainly higher up this sort of steps, the timing is more ripe for your solution. All right, so, and again, as we kind of evolve this conversation from the MVP discussion to going to market, it's always a good idea to understand who your competitors are, if they exist. Certainly they exist in some way, shape, or form. They might not be direct competitors, but it might be the solution that your customers are using to kind of work around the problem as best as they can. So here's a great example. You can find this online. A blogger named Mike Pono developed this. So if you Google Mike Pono competitive analysis, you'll be able to find this chart as well if it's too blurry. And you select your top 3 competitors, you go through all the details that you can find about them, and that really helps you understand like how they're going to market and what their product solution is and what problems it's solving and their position in the marketplace. This is also great to know, just by the way, for future M&A process as well. So as you develop the company, you measure a certain amount of success because you're tracking your KPIs, right? And you're getting to the point where you're like, okay, I'm at an inflection point where I either need to raise more money, maybe do some growth capital, or now might be the time to sell. Your competitors are going to be one of the companies that you want to know about selling to, them or like a private equity firm or or a larger partner that can take your product to a different scale. So this is a good exercise either way. All right, another great quote here. I like to pepper in quotes from smarter people than myself. Mark Birch, founder of Dev BizOps, says, good salespeople sell lots of product, but great salespeople make lots of customers successful. So again, that really speaks to, this is, what's the value proposition? Is it, is it just that you've got something cool with some bells and whistles, or you're actually solving that problem and making your customers more successful? That's what you really want to do. That's when you're really onto something. All right, so let's see how much time we've got. We still got plenty of time. So this is sort of an enterprise sales checklist. So, start with the people get your first customer, be a connector, solve problems, participate in industry events. That's a great way to get connected and to understand, some better aspects and angles of the problems that the industry faces. Join a committee. This actually speaks to other ways of sort of qualifying yourself as an entrepreneur sometimes too. Like when I started SickWeather, I didn't have any kind of degree in epidemiology or even data science, but through my experience, I got exposed to sort of working groups and different committees and volunteer groups with like the CDC and others, and got involved in those. So that's a great way to get some industry expertise as well, and to really help build yourself up as a subject matter expert, is to be part of committees like that. Partner with non-competing vendors. Certainly, there are going to be other bigger companies that can help you, that may have an interest in diversifying as well, and seeing how different technologies can be synergistic with what they're doing. Write for industry publications and press. white papers. That was one of the best marketing tools that we had. Early on at Sick Weather, we would do research and create white papers and put those out. You can use those as sales lead generators by putting them behind like an email sign up wall, collect email addresses as leads. You'll also find your competitors also trying to get access to these as you gain more of a profile in the landscape there. Use email campaigns, certainly. I mean, email's not dead. A lot of people think it is, but email's a great way to cut through the noise if you can do it right. Reach out through cold calls and emails. I mean, sometimes picking up the phone is really the best way to get through that white noise as well and connect with people. And again, it's sort of a lost art, and it's hard to do, and it's scary. But I think you'll find some of your best leads and connections are going to be made through picking up the phone. Publish white papers, I mentioned that, in addition to writing like op-eds and stuff like that. And of course, hire a rainmaker sales rep. That's sort of the last step, really, and that's when you can afford to do that. Or maybe you have a co-founder who can play that role. Who knows where Microsoft would be without Steve Ballmer, for example. So. All right, so a lesson to be learned from all this is when you market to everyone, you market to no one. That is from Harry Alford, co-founder of Humble Ventures. And so that brings us to the next sort of, again, facet of MVP, and that's your market segmentation and how to go to market with your MVP. Start with your customer. Identify the vertical industry, the pain value-based proposition, the competitor-based market segment, and technology-based segment. You can develop messages for each one of these, and then messages that are specific to each platform, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can really dial in your messaging to be very, very precise. And that's an exercise you should definitely do. And you don't have to be a marketing genius to follow these types of instructions and do that on your own. And this is another great resource by Mike Pono. And actually, this is my last slide. So we'll go to questions after this. I thought this was a really helpful tool too. Select your top three market segments that customer segments that you want to attack. Drill that down, break that down to the next 6 in the middle layer, and then cross out the ones that you've used in terms of the actual marketing segmentations. And that can help you kind of keep track of what you've done and what else you can be doing to make sure you've taken sort of a holistic approach to marketing and taking your product to market. And then of course, after you've changed your MVP again, if you've updated it, and you go back and go through this exercise again. So that's the whole presentation. We've got plenty of time, about 20 minutes or so, for any kind of other discussion or Q&A. And I'm happy to go back and recover things if anybody has any questions they want to drill down into on other topics.
Don't be shy.
Brian, good to see you.
Sorry, I had to join late, and my 11:30 ran over.
That's okay.
Can you talk about what I'll call failure and the need to you think you got to kind of keep restarting as you go through these customer segments? You do all this work, you think you got it figured out, you start marching down the path, and then a few trees start coming down all around you. You got to kind of back out and go back through again because you've experienced this. Can you kind of talk about what that's like, how you deal with it?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the presentation, I broke it down into different types of shifts from points of failure, or getting either inbound feedback, or you've solicited outbound feedback, or you've internally analyzed data that you're collecting to make to see, okay, what's actually working, what isn't working. And so, yeah, so through those three different shifts, whether it's demand, whether it's, from coming inbound, or whether it's outbound from surveys or analyzing the data, there are reasons, and let me go back to it actually, because I think you might be able to comment on some of this. Sorry. So yeah, I called them these three post MVP shifts. Now, there's also ultimate failure as well, like where you find out that nothing that you've done is working. And if that's the case, then I kind of go back to the design thinking process here, and I say, okay, that's when you just sort of start all the way over. You go back to square one, and you try to understand the problem again from a different perspective, perhaps. So, and maybe you find out that the problem is just not as big of a problem, and maybe that's where these shifts come into play. You go out, you have a discovery shift from surveying people, and you realize, that there's this is not the right solution. But at the same time, you could also, through this process, figure out a different solution to be first to market with a completely different idea that other people haven't thought of yet, because they haven't presumably gone through this process in the same way that you have with your domain expertise, approaching the problem from your perspective. And of course, the risk, and I kind of drilled down to the risks as well, with, for example, an outbound discovery, is that you might be eliciting feedback that's not actually something that is unbiased, or people are trying to help you, and they're trying to help you think of solutions or problems or other dimensions to this that aren't really as meaningful. And so you have to put that into context as well, and make sure it's actually something that's going to have demand and that's scalable, as opposed to being designed by a committee that doesn't really resonate with the industry as a whole. But anyway, yeah, these are the three basic shifts, as I put it, in terms of your MVP and understanding. Like, if you need to go back to the drawing board, it's usually one of these three reasons, and then this is the drawing board. Right? This design thinking process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and related to this, so as we always push the customer discovery, go out, talk to people. There's that fine line between talking to customers, competitors, potential collaborators, but also being wary that someone's going to poach your idea. That
Right.
you kind of lead too long about it. So how do you, again, you had to do all this, you built businesses. How did you go about walking that fine line between learning and not yet feeling you told someone your idea, and then you wake up and it's taken from you?
Well, I don't know how much you can really do to prevent that from happening. I used the example of when PayPal was first going to market, and people were asking them, how did you navigate so far ahead of the Visa, the MasterCards, and the American Expresses, who could have easily built the same solution? And their response to that, in their experience, was just that those companies were busy minding their own business, doing what they were, they were all sort of managers. There was no real founder entrepreneurship happening in those companies at that time that would encourage sort of outside the box thinking. Everyone was just focused on that. So you oftentimes, I think, even if you are talking to the person who could take that idea and copy it and run with it, oftentimes, if they are in the industry, they're embedded in the industry, they might not be in a position to actually do anything about it. So I think it's less, that's probably one of the least, that's one of the smaller risks to an entrepreneur, is having that competitor take it and run with it. At least I actually have seen it less frequently than I've seen other problems with product market fit being a problem. And if you've got competitors, if you've got people who are competitively interested in what you're doing, then that's great validation that you're onto something. And of course, what I heard a lot, to your question about, in my experience, what I heard a lot, especially from investors early on, was what's preventing Google or Facebook or Twitter from doing what you do? And I often thought about that PayPal example. And really, it hasn't, for the specific example of sick weather, it really wasn't something that they were really concerned about until now with the pandemic. Like now, contact tracing has brought all of that front and center. And yes, a lot of those big companies are poised to jump into this market and do what sick weather has been doing, and take it at a different scale. Now, hopefully the new CEO at Sick Weather and its new board and investors are all on top of this, and we've got enough, market share at this point with certain types of customers to be a worthy competitor still. But yeah, that's the risk, and sometimes it's market dynamics like a pandemic that it takes to change. In fact, to that point, one of my first investor pitches, 8 years ago for Sick Weather, I pitched this investor in Virginia. And she's like, what you're asking people to do is changing human nature, changing human behavior, I should say, not human nature, but behavior. And that's never going to happen. No one's ever going to change their behavior. No one's ever going to start coughing into their elbow or washing their hands more or social distancing back before that was a buzz term. Like these were all value propositions of knowing what illnesses were trending in your area, like how that would affect change. And to a certain extent, she was right. At that stage, at that time, that wasn't something that people were really willing to do to change that behavior. But it took this pandemic, to make all that much more feasible, I guess, from a standpoint of a product that serves those needs. Anyway, anybody else have questions? I'm happy to
Another question.
Pull back the curtain and talk more about my experience.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could speak to how you got involved with Shield Pals and more generally, how you're able to balance your time and attention when it comes to business.
That's a great question. I have found that balance comes from having a good sense of timing as opposed to time management. And which may sound counterintuitive or like a false equivalency, but I think that having an innate sense of timing that develops, the more of these types of projects you kind of take on, the more roles, the more hats you wear, you eventually get into a rhythm of things, and that really does help in managing these various ventures, and that. A successful entrepreneur is really an entrepreneur that has developed this innate sense of timing and less focused on time management. Time management itself does help in terms of managing your calendar, managing reminders, but to think about just purely from the perspective of time management is more of an analytical perspective and suggests that you can plan ahead for everything, and you can't. Opportunities will jump in front of you when they're good and ready. And you have to be willing to be able to respond. You can't say, oh, no, I'm on vacation right now. I'm blocked. My calendar's blocked. I can't deal with you right now. Like you can't do that. So it's a dance in that sense. It really is. It's like a dance. And having that sense of rhythm and dancing is a pretty good metaphor, I think. That was only part of your question, though. What was the other part? I think.
Just wondering how you got involved in Shield Pals in the first place.
It's sort of putting yourself out there. Once people know that you're an entrepreneur and that you've kind of established yourself as an entrepreneur, opportunities start to kind of come to you because you have a certain amount of expertise that other people might not have. In this case with Shield Pals, these were friends of mine who had started a business on their own, a husband, wife, mom and pop, exhibit, trade show business, did very, very well, ran it as a S Corp or LLC, never raised outside capital. Now they were in a position where they were developing something that was completely outside their experience in a healthcare realm that was outside their experience. So right away, me having worked in some way, shape, or form in healthcare and having some experience and exposure into the world of healthcare they came to me and said, hey, we don't know what to do. Like we want to make PPE, we want to make face shields, we want to make gowns. And one of the first people I turned them back to was Hopkins. I said, well, Hopkins has specifications on face shields and gowns. So that was the initial conversation. And then that evolved into, well, what if this grows bigger? Like, how do we raise money? Like, how does this grow bigger? I'm like, well, we're leaving the world of S Corps and LLCs now, and we're going to the world of C Corps and venture capital potentially. And that's why I got involved, was just because, when you have that experience, it's very few people really have the experience of raising outside venture capital, and you all will at some point gain that experience, and you will develop into subject matter experts on your own by virtue of having that experience. You just got to put yourself out there, and again, that's what will end up drawing people to you later on.
I had a question. Hi, Graham.
Hey.
At what? Hi.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, same. At what point, okay, so trying to put together an MVP, trying to figure out the S core, C core, do I sort of create an MVP and then sort of try to validate that, iterate, and at some point, maybe within, I don't know, a year or getting initial customers, then try to incorporate, or maybe go LLC and then go back? I don't know if all of that makes sense. But essentially, kind of like how to approach that pathway to becoming a company.
Yeah, well, so your MVP, you don't have to be fully scaled up as a C Corp and ready to go out and raise funding. And you may discover through that MVP design thinking process, surveying customers, all that kind of stuff, that you can actually go out on your own without raising millions of dollars in venture capital, that you can get to market without all of that, in which case you do want to stay as an LLC or an S Corp. There's a tax benefit to that, by the way, that I can explain if anybody has questions about that. So, but also there's nothing stopping you from converting from an LLC later on to a C Corp. And that's what I actually did with Sick Weather, because we started off as an LLC. We had our managers on the, I can't remember what it's called, the management agreement. And then when it came time to raise outside venture capital, which we weren't even sure if that was something we could do or would do, but eventually we attracted one of the most noteworthy investors, Brad Feld, whose Fund Foundry Group has been wildly successful out in Boulder, Colorado. He's a co-founder of Techstars, written several books. And once we had that opportunity to raise money with him and his, it was actually through his Angel List syndicate at the time, we had to convert, because these types of investors don't want to be responsible for, it might be the wrong word, but they don't want to deal with Schedule K-1s, as they're called, having the tax liability of being invested in this LLC. The reason why they prefer C Corps is because you don't get taxed on your ownership equity in the C Corp like you would in your participation of an LLC. In terms of the LLC will generate revenues and have a valuation, and their ownership is subject to a tax liability in that case, and they have to file what's called Schedule K-1 each year with their taxes, and that just becomes cumbersome for them. They could invest, but they prefer not to because it's cumbersome. So that's why the C Corp is the formation of choice if you're going to go outside and raise venture capital, because, and this is the disadvantage to a C Corp, is that you do get taxed on the revenue, but the ownership, the equity ownership, not experience any kind of tax for that. Not until you start doing distribution. So effectively, C Corps kind of get theoretically taxed twice. They get taxed on the revenue. They pay taxes on the revenue, and then the owners pay taxes on the distributions when they come through. Whereas in a C Corp and LLC, all that flows through. The company pays taxes, but then you don't have, you can pay yourself as payroll through distributions through your ownership of the company, and you don't have to pay payroll taxes or things like that at that point. So you're effectively only taxed once.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your talk. It was really great. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about joining the industry committees and like how somebody who's kind of junior and not really the expert might be able to get involved in something like that.
So here's a great example. NASA put out a call for community volunteers to join a working group. I was one of the first people to sign up. I knew nothing about, it was all about unmanned aerial vehicles or urban air mobility. But that was something I was really interested in, and I really wanted to learn more about it. And it was an open call, and I applied, and now I'm on this NASA working group. I have no business being on a NASA working group. I have no aerospace experience, but I'm learning from that experience. So there are opportunities that will come along. I was on a working group with the CDC and a company called National VOAD, Volunteer Organizations Against Disaster. And I got invited to that one because of my experience building sick weather, and they wanted to basically build something similar. But you know, again, you can go out and find these sort of volunteer opportunities, and there are going to be plenty of organizations out there that will welcome volunteers to come in and help, whether it's participating on a volunteer board or some sort of advisory council or something. And you know, you'll have something that you can bring and add value. So, you know, that's how you get started. You go out and you look for those volunteer opportunities, and then eventually you may get recruited you know, to be part of something like that.
Great, thanks.
My pleasure. Any other questions?
So, Graham, I have a parting question.
Sure.
So it's always great to give people advice, and it pretty quickly can add up to a grocery store list of things that no one would ever have the time to do if they're going to go do what they actually want to get done. So oftentimes it's kind of what one or two things might make a difference for someone. So like when I talk to people, two things I would point out to them. One is that they should do I-Corps for reasons that we all know about, that it has such a lasting and profound impact. And if I were to suggest a book to people, oftentimes it's The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz, which I think is a great thing. What kind of couple of things would you pass on to people to say, you know, these are worth, you know, these couple of things are worth your time, can really have an impact on what you're doing?
Well, if you haven't been through the experience of putting a 10-slide pitch deck together, that's a great exercise that, you know, it helps you think about your business from the perspective of someone who would invest, right? And it puts you through the exercise of doing your market research, you know, understanding your marketplace, understanding your customers, understanding your revenue model, understanding your brand, you know, and how that looks, you know, in the context of this pitch deck. So I think that's a really important step. Also, another great book, I think it's called Founder Stories. It's a collection of stories from different founders, and that's where I got the PayPal story from, was from that book, Founder Stories, and it's great insight. I know Brad Feld has several great books too, and David Cohen from Techstars. But that Founder Story one, it's easy to read too. It's a quick read. They're nice little short chapters that just kind of are these anecdotes, one right after the other, different founders. I'm sure you'll find something to relate to in that. But yeah, I mean, I think going through the exercise, even if you don't have a product yet or an MVP and you haven't gone through the design thinking process, it's almost like when I used to live in Los Angeles, there were these movie producers that would come up with ideas, and they would put them in the context of a movie poster, and they would go to distribution channels. They'd be like, this is what I'm going to make, is this movie. And all they had is the movie poster. But it put them through an exercise of, what's this all going to look like in the end? And is it worth anything? And I think the exercise of building your pitch deck is something that you can't ever start too soon, you know? So if there's any first step, you know, to helping you understand how you're going to build your company, what it's going to look like, it's starting off with, you know, sketching out that first 10-slide pitch deck. And gosh, what's the guy? What's his name? Guy. I forget his name. He's a fellow at Apple now. Anyway, he has the sort of perfect 10-slide deck that, you know, investors expect in terms of which slides you want to include. Is it Fukuyama? I can't remember his last name.
We've also got a presentation guide, which was literally borrowed from anyone we could find, someone with a worthwhile idea, if anyone ever wants a copy of it.
Guy Kawasaki, sorry. So yes, obviously go to the resources that Hopkins has for you there first. But just so that I can, for my own edification, not have that senior moment of forgetting Guy Kawasaki's name.
Reid Hoffman put the original LinkedIn deck out there too. You can just Google that. He put it out there for that very reason.
Yeah,
People be
that's
able to
right.
learn from it. Wish I had that deck the day before he did.
Yeah, I know, right? And finding a community too. I mean, you mentioned I-Corps, and obviously you're all involved in FastForward University, which is also the same thing. It's like, go find that community. I mean, this 1 Million Cups thing that I do, it's a weekly speaking series for entrepreneurs to get out and just sort of meet people and share their ideas. It's like a 6-minute pitch or presentation, and doing stuff like that, getting out into the community, meeting other people, and starting to really network. I mean, that's, again, something you can't ever start doing too soon.
Great.
Great, fantastic. Well, it is now 1 o'clock. So I want to say thank you to all of you guys again for attending today's MVP workshop, and especially thank you to Graham for this amazing presentation. I will be sending out links so that you guys can view this recording later on at your own time, but feel free to reach out to us if you guys have any questions, and stay tuned for more events from us. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks for having me. Good luck,
Take care.
everybody. Bye-bye.